All right, this video is a brief introduction to campaign finance. That's what you're going to learn about in this module. That's what we're going to focus on this week. You might ask, why are we spending an entire week on campaign finance? If you opened up an American politics textbook, you probably wouldn't find an entire chapter devoted to campaign finance. But I think that the role that money plays in our elections is something that oftentimes gets neglected by political scientists in the classroom. And this is important for you guys to know as voters, because I know that oftentimes we struggle with figuring out which political candidate is going to protect our interests or pursue our interests. And I think that, in fact, following the money trail, looking at where a political candidate is getting their money from and how they are financing their campaign is a really, really helpful tool in deciding who you might choose to vote for. So I'm hoping that this module, that this content that you're learning here in this class is something that you can utilize for the rest of your life as a voter. Okay, so briefly, let's talk about values that are essential to any democracy. What are the important foundations of any democracy? How can you tell whether or not a society, a government is truly democratic? Well, one of the most important characteristics of any democracy, specifically a representative democracy, is that there are regularly held free, fair, and legitimate elections. In other words, we can trust that the elections have integrity. In addition to that, you guys, if you were brainstorming right now and you came up with your own list, I think a lot of us would say that freedom of press, the ability to criticize the government, write negative articles or news stories about the government is an important component of any democracy. And in addition to that, maybe civilian control of the military, accountability, and transparency. In other words, when the government takes in tax revenue, we should know what the government is spending that tax revenue on. That information should be available to us, so on and so forth. But if I asked you guys, what role should money play? To what extent should we allow money to influence elections? And to what extent should political candidates be able to finance their own campaigns? Should they be able to collect money from interest groups? Should they be able to take donations from wealthy individuals or CEOs of Fortune 500 companies? You probably have to pause and think about it for a second. Like, there's no really clear answer to this question. So this is the question that I want you to attempt to answer this week by going through all of the content in this module, right? Because here's the thing, campaign finance, I think, is something that we fail to pay attention to as voters. When we think about an election, for instance, when we think about the upcoming 2020 presidential election, we think, okay, we've got to turn out to the polls in November and we're going to have to vote for some people. So there are going to be a pool of candidates running for a position. And then I'm going to vote for my favorite candidate. And whichever candidate wins the majority of votes will win that position and will represent me, maybe in the House of Representatives or the Senate or the President in the White House. However, there's a bunch of stuff happening behind the scenes, and there's a bunch of things that have been going on for the last couple years that led up to these candidates being able to run in the first place. And that is this kind of like secondary campaign. Well, it comes before anything else, but hopefully you know what I mean by that. It's sort of what I refer to as a fundraising contest. So, in order to run a campaign, you have to have a lot of money. I know you guys probably get sick of um, hearing from candidates during election season. And that's because when you go on your Facebook, when you go on your Instagram, when you go to turn the television on, when you turn on your radio, it's like you're listening to these political candidates beg or ask for your vote over and over and over again. Those are advertisements, and advertisements cost money. So, in order to run for political office, you first have to sort of win this fundraising contest. So, this raises a bunch of questions about things like, for instance, whether or not we should allow candidates to self finance. Okay, so John McCain, for instance, has self financed his campaign. Tom Steyer, a recent Democratic primary candidate, very wealthy individual, paid for his own campaign. Mike Bloomberg, right? So the question is, should rich people be able to use their own money to run for political office, right? But in addition to that, we can ask other questions about this phase or this sort of part of the process in running for a political office. For instance, should we allow candidates to take large sums of money in the form of donations from private corporations? The reason we might think that that is undemocratic, or the reason we might be worried about that, concerned about that, is, well, if they win political office, they may then remain loyal to that private corporation who elected them and pursue that private corporation's interests rather than representing the citizens who actually voted for them at this stage of the process. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense. One thing that I want to underline is just how few Americans participate in this first initial contest, this first phase of running for political office. To give you some numbers to really underline this further, in 2016, this was the year that President Trump, or Donald Trump, won the presidency, less than 1% of Americans, only 0.5%, gave more than $200 to a political candidate. Here's another number that drives this home even further. A total of 82,000 people, right, mind you, there are 350 million people that live here in the United States, gave 2/3 of all of the money, the total funds that were spent in the 2016 election. So this tells you that there sort of is this very small percentage of Americans. There's this elite minority group that is deciding who gets past this first initial obstacle to running for political office before those candidates are even put in front of the people at large, right? So in the long run, how does this affect us as just everyday average Americans? Well, we know that Congress is only responsive to people that vote on a regular basis. But in addition to that, we know that congressmen and congresswomen are even more responsive to their wealthy voters. In other words, if there is a piece of legislation that a House of Representative member has to decide what they're going to vote on in the following days, right? And let's say they have to decide whether or not they're going to vote yes or no on the Affordable Care Act. Let's sort of rewind, get back in a time machine, go back to 2010. Instead of looking at the congressional district that they represent at large and evaluating all of the demographics for every single person that lives in that congressional district, They instead survey the people in their district that finance their campaigns, right? The sort of wealthy elite. And they ask themselves, what would these voters want me to do? Would they want me to vote yes, or would they want me to vote no on the Affordable Care Act? And oftentimes, that's what your House of Representative members or your senators choose to do. Okay. So, campaign finance not only affects who gets to run for political office in the first place, but it also affects the voting decisions and the policy outcomes on Capitol Hill that affect our everyday lives, right? Um, One last thing